Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this week's edition of BookBytes. We're at the tail end of a fantastic week of celebrating literature. I've just come through the Time of the Writer Festival, which has been successfully taken online. So we've had over 100 authors over the last few days converging in the space and creating these wonderful discussions. And tonight in particular, we have author and media personality Joanne Joseph on air. This is our postponed interview, so I'm going to make the most of this time and get into the meat of her beautiful novel, Children of Sugarcane. Joanne doesn't need a huge introduction in the South African media and literary spaces. She's an established South African media personality, best-selling author with over 20 years of experience. She's hosted prominent radio and television shows for major broadcasters like Prime Media House and the SABC. Her book, Drug Mule, sold over 10,000 copies, which gives it best-selling status in South Africa, and Children of Sugarcane is Joanne's first work of historical fiction. Welcome, Joanne. It's so lovely to finally have this opportunity to chat to you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Shafinaaz. Lovely to be with you, and congratulations on the great work you've been doing this week in all your interviews on Time of the Writer.
Thank you so much. I think the wonderful thing about these festivals is that it just inspires you to keep writing. If you ever feel that, you've kind of hit a ceiling, new work just emerges out of these discussions. So I was very glad to be a part of that. So the wonderful thing...
No, it was lovely listening to what you had to say on those panels. I really thought your input was fantastic.
Thank you for joining in. I wish we'd had a panel, but now we have this opportunity to talk about these books that we love. And most especially, it's great to have a show and give a glowing review, but there was something so beautifully spiritual about reading your book. And it reminded me why I think writing as a spiritual sort of experience. This idea of writing historical fiction. You say in many interviews that it took 9 years to write, but I'd love to hear more about your writing process and what it was for you delving into the past and being a medium for Shanti's story.
So, Shafinaaz, it took me such a long time because I wasn't a writer of fiction, for starters. I had read and studied a lot of fiction over the years, but hadn't had experience actually writing it. And that was what made it such a difficult enterprise for me in the first place. But, it took 9 years because to refine the art of writing a historical fiction novel. It's a very difficult genre in which to write. And it took me a very long time to learn how to marry the kind of history that you read, the research that you internalize and digest over a period of 9 years, and combine that with a narrative that would be palatable to the reader. It's a very, very difficult task indeed, and it was a great experience. I mean, you talk about it being a spiritual read. In a way, it does take it out of you emotionally, because writing it does, of course, require you to travel back to that time, a very traumatic time of our history, when you are delving into some of the atrocities that were committed against people in this country. And of course, they're your ancestors, and you certainly feel a connection to them. But the reality of writing about colonization as a whole is actually quite a difficult process, because you're suddenly going back in time and you're looking at events that have shaped your present day reality. And even though people may have been forgotten about, their stories may have been forgotten about or brushed under the carpet, or simply forgotten because of the intergenerational trauma or shame that has occurred from the kinds of terrible things that happened to them, you're required to go back into the past, to dredge up those events and relive them, to convert them into historical fiction. So that is quite emotionally demanding.
I can appreciate the kind of work that goes into taking that step from your report writing, your fact-finding mission that report writing is, and using some of that technique, but also the multi-dimensional approach that's needed to write fiction, to recreate these characters and these dialogues, and to put yourself in a time that you haven't lived in, and you do that so successfully, obviously. It really is stepping into the past. And I can see this visually, working itself into other mediums in the form of, hopefully, in the form of film someday. The thing is, how impactful is writing historical fiction, reaching into the past to a younger generation of readers? Is this writing for people who have had a close sense of where they come from, or is this really amenable to a younger readership? Shanti is 14 years old when she takes her first major step. What is the response been?
It's difficult to gauge the response from younger readers. It's interesting. It's a very interesting question because I've had conversations with them. So my daughter, for example, invited me to speak to kids as young as sort of 13. They're in grade 8. And I took a slightly different approach with them because I think colonization and indenture is it's a sensitive topic, and it's quite a traumatic topic for young people in many ways. And of course, in high school, they're just coming into their own. They're just being exposed, starting to be exposed really to the atrocities of the past. So I took a slightly different approach with them, and I kept it quite factual and quite historical. But I find the engagement with older students, so in other words, students in grade 11 or 12 who are about to school, your matriculants and so forth, there's a different level of thinking. And in our country, children are just naturally, I think, quite politicized because of the history from which our country comes. So a lot of these children, all of these children, in fact, that we are now speaking about, the Generation Zs, are actually born into struggle in so many ways. It may not be the anti-apartheid struggle, it is the struggle of democracy, though, that carries with it the vestiges of apartheid. And so the kids that I've spoken to so far have been quite woke in the sense that they are fully aware that they're perhaps fully aware of the details of the history that they come from, but they know that there's been suffering. They know that they are still suffering the vestiges, the realm of that history. They know that they've got some kind of struggle and they're looking for a purpose at this time in history. And so it's been very interesting for them, particularly when I was speaking to the matriculants, or the matrics, I should say. They're about to matriculate at the end of the year. But when I was talking to those girls, it is a girls' school, they were deeply interested in the history, and they didn't want to stop listening, actually. They're so enchanted by these questions about the past. They wanted to know more. It's funny that we paint this generation as one that is only interested in the superficial, or is very materialistic, doesn't have a deep understanding of history, because they're present. This is very much the just add water generation in some ways, but in other ways they are searching. They're searching for some form of identity. They're searching for an anchor in terms of their history. And so I'm hoping, if the children I've engaged so far are anything to go by, that this will be something that is accessible to them and something that is interesting to them, hopefully. I mean, you mentioned the fact that the protagonist is 14 years old, and that's quite important. Hopefully, there's some sort of engagement with the reality that this could have been their lives had they not been born in the current generation. But of course, for many of them, the struggle is almost the same in this present day.
I find it particularly interesting if you really imagine that, to really imagine that a 14-year-old could take and at the time, in the early 19th century, if she could take the kind of steps that she took to further her life, to get out of her situation, however limiting she might have found it, and to have that impetus to go out and break those boundaries in so many ways, to glean information, to take the trip, to speak to the agent that is working with taking people off to the port of Natal. It's beyond imagination, and she's able to do that at a time when you might think it is quite a stretch. And she accomplishes that in so many ways, and that strength of character that comes through in Shanti's development throughout the different choices that she makes is such a powerful telling. It's so telling of what young people are capable of, what women are capable of, and a reminder. And I think that in particular, would resonate, or at least inspire younger readers. I particularly like what Professor Jensen says about if the decolonization moment needed an engaging, educative text for schools and universities, this book would be required reading. He's got quite a nice half a page. I'm just reading the last bit because he's absolutely correct. This book of, you call it fiction, but this book is not a current popular read that will fizzle out in the few months that it's been launched and be lauded as pretty writing or beautiful writing. This book really should have traction in schools and universities because it's a very important social document as well, of our time, and it gives a sense that getting into a textbook telling of the tale just doesn't do the same justice that your book has done. Your vision for both the process of your writing, but also your vision for where this tale and this text will go. Do you have any plans for taking it into different art forms?
Shafinaaz, there isn't much in the pipeline just yet. I mean, the book was only released in October, but I think it's very kind of you to say this, and certainly very kind of Professor Jonathan Jansen to have given me that kind of endorsement for the book. I'm hoping the book will have some life outside of its current form. It seems there is a little bit of interest from filmmakers at this stage, so I'm just going to see how that pans out and, take my time with just deciding if it eventually becomes a film or a series of some kind, who would be best to do justice to it, I suppose. But I do agree that texts of this nature, and I'm not saying my book do it necessarily, but texts of this nature that help us understand decolonization are quite important. For the young people we were speaking about, for example, I mean, we take for granted the fact that we speak of Shanti as a young woman, for example, but actually in real terms, she's not a young woman by any stretch of the imagination. She's a teenager. And I think it's really important to draw that comparison, which Selvan Naidu has really done quite well in a piece he recently wrote, an article he wrote about the labor and exploitation of the young as well as the female during indenture. I often say to my daughter, for example, can you imagine? She's 15 years old. Can you imagine what it must have been like to be a 14 or a 15-year-old during that time? We know that indenture allowed for, on paper anyway, for children from the age of 16 upwards to register and to sign up for. But that wasn't the reality in practice. I mean, there are narratives of children as young as 2 or 3 being separated from their families and being put into different colonial homes to learn how to sew buttons on shirts or pick tea leaves because their hands are small, So, it's a really instructive thing, I hope, for young people to be able to engage, the story of indenture, that is. I also feel that we're bandying about this term decolonization right now. It's an important term, and it's something that should mean something to us. But I don't know that we have the full picture of colonization yet. Do we actually know in detail what happened to the people in this country? Do we know what atrocities were committed? Has any formal apology been made? What are we owed? Is there any kind of compensation that has been thought of? And we're approaching the land question now. We talk about land all the time, but land, on the one hand, on the most superficial level, is the land that was stolen from people, the indigenous people of this country. But on the other hand, it's also a metaphor for everything else that was taken away, including the dignity of the people of this country, both Black people who inhabited it first, and the rest of our ancestors who settled here. And when we talk about that, we're trying to get a grip on the past, I think. We're trying to fill up what is a blank canvas in our minds, really, of what happened to us during colonization. And I hope books like this go some way in explaining the extent of it, what was taken away from us, and what we will never be able to restore in whole, in a whole entirely. But I hope that it will give us some sense of what we can do to start the process of making us whole again as Africans, but also perhaps re-Africanizing ourselves in a sense that gives us some sort of sense of pride of who we are. I think that might be really useful.
You touch on so many things that bring out a host of questions now. Obviously, economic redress in the distribution of land, and restoring dignity, which you know rightly point out. Um, uh, a book like this is a very good starting point. It builds the bridges and the windows into re-understanding each other because of the kind of fragmentation that we've experienced as a society. And then when you come back to identity, I mean, you speak of the title Children of Sugarcane, those children that were born on the plantations and who are then also intercepted into the menial labor of the plantations and in various ways taken into the homes of the colonizers and made to work. Shanti wants to save her child from that kind of an experience, and how fate seems to have a very different way for her. You might actually think someone up there is looking out for her. I have a comment coming in. Children of Sugarcane is such a layered read with meticulous historical research that illuminates an unexplored part of our collective colonial history. On a purely aesthetic level, it's a lyrically written, utterly beautiful read that immerses the reader in Shanti's life. Absolutely. That's from Aisha Kaji. And, it I think it beautifully reopens the imagination to what has been hidden, what has been forgotten, known but forgotten. And you've given new life to history. Given new life to what has happened and reopened the conversation around. So it's not just about having Children of Sugarcane on your bookshelf because it's a historical read and we want to hold on to an important part and a piece of history, but really the responsibility to take on those conversations again through creating bridges to take on those conversations and to sort of extend the conversations as well. A lot of our young people, when you speak to them, don't identify as Indian. Many of them have never been to the subcontinent, and the politics of our time, put them in a position where there's local identity, there's a struggle of local economic and identity politics, and they're consumed by that. But understanding where this started and where it comes from, not just for people of Indian origin, I think for South Africans and Southern Africans in general, makes this in a very valuable and important read. I want to step back a little and go back to the research aspect of this book, your process, your writing process over the years, your vision, your process, and carrying it on from there. Please talk to us through some of that.
So, Shafinaaz, I write quite quickly in very short bursts. That doesn't sound very true when I tell you it took me 9 years to complete this book. But that's I can turn over a book quite quickly if I know what I'm doing. I didn't know what I was doing when I set out to do this, but I spend, in general, before I write anything, I spend a great deal of time reading. And I was developing the plot alongside the reading, and there is a vast amount of reading to do. We are fortunate that we've got a body of historians in this country who are just so academically sound in the way they've approached indenture. They've set out just about every aspect you can think of, in different ways. So some of them have taken a pictorial approach. Some have worked with text and the archives, and so you can build up quite a rounded and holistic picture of indenture. There are of course little bits missing because they're still busy working at it and broadening the archive as we speak. But on the whole, the documentation of what has existed so far is fairly sound, and it's fairly comprehensive enough for one to be able to turn it into a novel of this nature. I believe one of the historians has told me that there are boxes and boxes of information about indenture that are sitting somewhere right now, undiscovered or unexplored at this point. So we have scratched the tip of indenture with stories like this, and there are many more stories to be told. But I'm digressing now. I should actually limit it to my research, which took me quite a long time. I researched and I wrote a little, and I researched and I wrote a little. And of course, there's a great deal of rewriting in between, because you're also, as a writer, grappling with this notion of whether you should how much history, because you're reading a vast amount of history, right? Reams and reams of it. And you have to figure out what part of that you are actually going to retain for your story. What is going to be the backdrop? How much are you going to allow that backdrop of indenture to intrude into the lives of your characters? Because, of course, the personal is political and the political is personal. So you've got to maintain a very strong backdrop and a very strong structure of indenture while you tell the stories of these individuals who are almost pawns in history's game and in the game of the colonizers. That the writing of that took me a very, very long time. I started off with a very deeply factual manuscript, and by the 22nd iteration, which is the one you have now read, it had evolved from that into a much shorter manuscript in which certain themes had been put on the back burner, certain omissions had been made from the text, because you simply have to accept the idea that it is just a novel of 300 odd pages, and you cannot fit the entire history of indenture into those pages, and so you end up dwelling on the most salient points. But I was also busy with a PhD during this, particularly towards the tail end of my having completed the book. And that was such a valuable experience for me as well, because my topic pertains to the depiction of female indentured laborers in the existing canon of literature in South Africa. It's a small canon, but it's an important one. And there are many important forerunners who have written about indenture already, and who have started to inject their story narratives into the victim, because those narratives were not given equal status, the kind of status that other types of African or South African literature have received. It's been hugely unfair to those writers, but I was very grateful to be able to stand on their shoulders and also look at those texts and ask myself, what is missing in my view from those texts, or what has been prevented from entering the public domain in those texts? For me, the biggest deal was the fact that a lot of these narratives have been told from the perspectives of either men or families when we look at the story of indenture, but very little focuses on the female, the woman's indentured experience. And for me, that is the weakness right now, that I felt we needed to inject text into the canon that talks specifically about the experience of women, and in particular young women or even teenagers, as is the case with my protagonist, Shanti. So then the process began of writing and shaping the text, and eventually, I mean, with the help of my editor, Helen Moffat, who was very rigorous and very honest about what she thought should stay and what should go, I was able to shape the text into something more palatable.
As much as the story of adventure can shape the plot and the movement of your tale, getting into the mind of a character that lived over 100 years ago and a teenager of that time who is less inhibited than we might imagine, does crash and smash stereotypes. Um, Creating characters is a multi-dimensional thing. It's not just sort of pen on paper and you have a character. And you've done that very successfully. What was it like to create Shanti, and how much of her is really fiction and how much is not?
Right, you tend to absorb interesting aspects about the people around you. So there are lots of modern day people I interact with who bear those hallmarks of Shanti, or perhaps it's the other way around. Perhaps Shanti bears their hallmarks. So I've got a lot of strong women around me, and whether it's my mom, my godmother who suffered many disease, various other family members or friends that I'm really close to, I'm drawing on the strength of those women as well, because I know there's something quite universal about it. You might be writing about a character who's living in the 21st century or the 18th century for that matter, and some truths are simply universal. I also drew on what I knew about the character of my great-grandmother. So she was the one who actually got me started on this journey to find out more about indenture and more about her life. And I was only able to glean part of that from the archive, because, of course, unless there was something quite exceptional, that landed them in the public eye. Most indentured women were largely invisible during that time. And so I was able to gain some information about her. But Shafinaaz, I also imagined that certain things had traveled through the generations. And I see this particularly from my mom's work ethic, her stoicism, her resilience, her response to hardship, and so forth. I can well imagine that that has traveled through generations. And I hope that I've been imbued with those characteristics as well. I'm certainly already seeing them in my daughter. So the idea I thought was, let me take some of what exists in the present and combine that with what I know has existed in women in the past in order for them to survive and thrive and ensure that their families did the same. And let me combine those aspects and wrap them up into these shells of the characters that I've been creating. And I hope that was what worked really and made the characters just a little bit more identifiable, more accessible, perhaps.
Well, your characters are certainly not cardboard cutouts. They're very authentic, and they really draw one in. And I was able to travel through the eyes of Shanti in this book. But your male characters as well. I mean, they are some flawed. They make the decisions that they need to make. Some strong characters. Shanti makes her friends along the way. She's got Devi and Farooq, Mustafa, and many others, both from the village and in I find it odd when I say Port Natal or the colony of Natal. It's immediately sort of that inertia back and forth, understanding what we know it to be. And but of course that's why I see the visual so strongly when you write about the past in the way that you do. And there's anger as well. There's anger in the way that they're treated, and the sort of the audacity of the colonizer and the master and the way that laborers were treated and that sort of thing. The exploitation, as much as they were seen as lesser human, the women were exploited. They were raped. That's rape is a difficult thing to write about. You metaphysize it in a very, very beautiful way. One starts to think that, is this really a reptile that she's talking about? There's a scene, that's almost like reptilian, where the rapist is almost seen as reptilian. It's beautifully rendered and striking, and it's powerful, but it's also it incites a lot of anger. Your comment on writing about the general experiences of women in the book, women and men in the book.
Um, I guess I think one has to make the admission. Sometimes you're very angry with the men in the book, and that's regardless of whether they are the patriarchal figures of colonization or the patriarchal figures of Indian cultures that also trap the women equally in some ways. And so, I do write from a position of anger, Shafinaaz. I write from a position of anger of being a 21st century woman who witnesses that continued violence around us, who continues to witness the kind of the fear and the helplessness and the despair that many women in this country feel. And it almost feels like this should not be a 21st century reality, but it still is. How is it possible that we're still having these conversations about gender-based violence on the same level over 160 years later? After these atrocities have occurred, and we've had time to pore over them, and we've had time, hopefully, even in the last 30 years, which is not a long time in the greater scheme of things, but perhaps it is enough time just to start looking at these things and addressing them in a way that takes them seriously, that demonstrates we're serious about eradicating gender-based violence. And yet, we're nowhere near that stage yet. We are still having the same conversations, and that's what makes me write from a place of anger. And so, it wasn't difficult for me to access that anger in talking about the past. The characters, the male characters, are dangerous in so many ways, whether they are merely emotionally dangerous to the women, whether they pose a physical danger to the women. I mean, they could be men on the ship, they could be the ship's crew, They could be other Indian indentured laborers, the men who've traveled with the women on the ships to come to the colony of Natal. They could be men in the village that Shanti grows up in, who remain a threat to them in so many ways, whether it's a physical threat, whether they present a kind of threat from a caste basis, whether they present a threat as the man that this young girl will be betrothed to. There's an example with one character who has married quite an abusive man, and Shanti, despite wanting to do something to help her friend to get her out of that situation, is unable to do so. And so I did want to give that sense that men are dangerous to us in some ways, and we have not resolved that 160 years later. And yet, in many ways, men remain the victims of patriarchy themselves. So they are born into a system of toxic masculinity. They're born into cultural systems, into religious systems, into caste systems that oppress them as well, and have certain expectations of them that are quite toxic in their masculinity. And so, in a way, particularly with the love of Shanti's life, Mustafa, we've got a situation where, I mean, on the face of it, and I think overall we can say he's a good guy, right? He's one of the good guys in the novel. His intentions are good. His intention is not to hurt, but he does end up hurting Shanti. And simply because he hasn't had the same strength of character that she has had to fight off the kind of cultural constraints that he has experienced. And in a way, I hope to some extent as well, particularly with other characters, male characters who suffer violence on the plantations, it's clear that men too, and Indian men in particular in this context, suffer deep emasculation. It's a kind of profound emasculation that African men have suffered under our colonizers as well. And that was carried through and perpetuated through apartheid as well. And it was something that I thought a lot about during the recent upsurge in violence, the July looting from last year, that kind of show of masculinity, high masculinity, toxic masculinity. It's still with us. And where does it come from? And I think it's always quite useful when we look at even present day male citizens of this country to go back a couple of hundred where that started, where the emasculation started, and what it has possibly resulted in over the centuries.
And I think precisely what makes your novel so identifiable in today's age is that these waves of emotion and being and identity come through so strongly, but are still relatable today. The emasculation of men through the system of oppression and patriarchy, and the somehow, should I say, the resilience of women that is, the stoicism and resilience of women that's shown through in being able to survive and thrive, in fact, regardless of the structures that oppress and reduce their autonomy. Joanne, thank you so much for a brilliant, not just a brilliant book, but a very provocative interview as well, because we've been able to get into a relatively good amount of what your writing process was important, but also your motivations and your inspiration for this project that is Children of Sugarcane. I'd like to give you a few seconds or a minute or two just to say a little bit, just any last message that you'd like to leave us with. And I certainly hope that many people will be picking up this book and reading it for time to come.
Shafinaaz, just want to say thank you so much for having me this evening. It's really been lovely being interviewed by a fellow author, someone who is so accomplished herself, and many congratulations to you for the great work you're doing. And I do also want to say to the young writers out there, there's just a vast amount of knowledge, of information, of history that is relatively untapped in our country, right? There are all these little stories that will pop up every now and then. I think to myself, when I come across those excerpts or extracts of books or a little snippet here and there in the newspaper, I think to myself, gosh, here's a novel. Here's potentially a novel. It just needs a little bit of research, a good writer behind it to get it out there. I would really like us to start taking pride in our stories as South Africans and Africans by extension. There's so much talent in the country. I hope that someone out there is watching or listening who is able to say, this is what I'm going to put my money behind. I'm going to put my money or my energy into creating the next generation of writers who are going to fill in the blanks in our history, tell our history in a more comprehensive way, but one that also leaves a legacy for future generations and instills pride in us as Africans. And writing does that. We know that. We know that writing is one of the greatest tools for memorialization and immortalization. And I would love anyone who has a love for literature, or even if you don't, and are developing a love for literature, I would really love to be able to say this is a worthwhile project. We have so many needs on the go in this country, Shafinaaz. We've got great need in all sorts of areas, and the impoverishment in our country is such a debilitating factor in so many ways. But as we develop sport in this country, as we develop maths and science and all the other things we need to shore up the next generation, I believe that history and literature are two of the most important tools in psychologically restoring us as a people. And I wish that we would get a little bit more energy and a greater push in that direction.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because when we look at, I hope Ismail Mohammed is watching, Time of the Writer has also done such fantastic work in encouraging this sort of thing. We've just come through the week, so I'm feeling so grateful for the work that they do. And absolutely, even if it means starting from, I think it takes a lot of courage to write memoir. I've said this on panels, I've said this before. But just to start documenting personal family history is such an important thing because I think it has sort of a rebounding effect in terms of how much we can collect from each other. And our personal stories and our personal histories are very important. Family histories are very important because it allows us to sort of join that dotted line to create that trajectory of material that we need to be able to draw on. And yes, researchers and writers, no matter how assuming, will be able to put those stories together, to be able to draw on those stories. And I also have a strong matriarchal lineage. I'm the first daughter of the first daughter of the first daughter of the only daughter. And I take pride in that. And I've managed to put together just a book of family photographs with very basic data going back quite a few generations. It's important, even if it's not for the public domain, to have that material documented because you never know when the next generation will need resource to look back upon. And I really thank you for bringing that up as well because we hope and we that there's motivation out there for older people and younger people to sit down and make notes, ask stories, use a dictaphone, speak to your elders, document that family history, and write more about the past. And with that, this has been such a wonderful discussion. I know that there'll be many opportunities for more writing and more reading. I do believe that this is a very important book. I hope that people will be picking up copies, add it to your family library, gift it to people. Teachers, please put it onto your reading list for school. This not just generates discussion, but I think will be just a beautiful read for everyone. And that's it from now for me from now for this week's session of Book Bites. I look forward to joining you again next week when we speak to another South African author. And from now, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.